Colonel Starbottle for the Plaintiff by Bret Harte from Harper's Magazine. It had been a day of triumph for Colonel Starbottle. First, for his personality, as it would have been difficult to separate the Colonel's achievements from his individuality. Second, for his oratorical abilities as a sympathetic pleader. And third, for his function as the leading counsel for the Eureka Ditch Company versus the state of California. On his strictly legal performances in this issue I prefer not to speak. There were those who denied them, although the jury had accepted them in the face of the ruling of the half-amused, half-cynical judge himself. For an hour they had laughed with the Colonel, wept with him, been stirred to personal indignation or patriotic exultation by his passionate and lofty periods. What else could they do than to give him their verdict? If it was alleged by some that the American Eagle, Thomas Jefferson, and the resolutions of '98 had nothing whatever to do with the contest of a ditch company over a doubtfully worded legislative document, that wholesale abuse of the state attorney and his political motives had not the slightest connection with the legal question raised, it was, nevertheless, generally accepted that the losing party would have been only too glad to have the Colonel on their side. And Colonel Starbottle knew this, as, perspiring, florid, and panting, he rebuttoned the lower buttons of his blue frock coat, which had become loosed in an oratorical spasm, and readjusted his old-fashioned spotless shirt frill above it as he strutted from the courtroom amidst the handshakings and acclamations of his friends. And here an unprecedented thing occurred. The Colonel absolutely declined spirituous refreshment at the neighboring Palmetto Saloon, and declared his intention of proceeding directly to his office in the adjoining square. Nevertheless, the Colonel quitted the building alone, and apparently unarmed except for his faithful gold-headed stick, which hung as usual from his forearm. The crowd gazed after him with undisguised admiration of this new evidence of his pluck. It was remembered also that a mysterious note had been handed to him at the conclusion of his speech, evidently a challenge from the state attorney. It was quite plain that the Colonel, a practiced duelist, was hastening home to answer it. But herein they were wrong. The note was in a female hand, and simply requested the Colonel to accord an interview with the writer at the Colonel's office as soon as he left the court. But it was an engagement that the Colonel, as devoted to the fair sex as he was to the code, was no less prompt in accepting. He flicked away the dust from his spotless white trousers and varnished boots with his handkerchief, and settled his black cravat under his Byron collar as he neared his office. He was surprised, however, on opening the door of his private office to find his visitor already there. He was still more startled to find out her somewhat past middle age and plainly attired. But the Colonel was brought up in a school of Southern politeness, already antique in the Republic, and his bow of courtesy belonged to the epoch of his shirt frill and strapped trousers. No one could have detected his disappointment in his manner, albeit his sentences were short and incomplete. But the Colonel's colloquial speech was apt to be fragmentary incoherencies of his larger oratorical utterances. "1,000 pardons for, having kept the lady waiting, but congratulations of friends and courtesy due to them interfered with the perhaps only heightened by procrastination pleasure of..." And the Colonel completed his sentence with a gallant wave of his fat but white and well-kept hand. "Yes, I came to see you along of that speech of yours. I was in court. When I heard you getting it off on that jury, I says to myself, that's the kind of lawyer I want. A man that's flowery and convincing. Just the man to take up our case." "Oh, it's a matter of business, I see," said the Colonel, inwardly relieved but externally careless. "And may I ask the nature of the case?" "Well, it's a breach of promise suit," said the visitor calmly. If the Colonel had been surprised before, he was now really startled, and with an added horror that required all his politeness to conceal. Breach of promise cases were his peculiar aversion. He had always held them to be a kind of litigation which could have been obviated by the prompt killing of the masculine offender, in which case he would have gladly defended the killer. But a suit for damages? Damages? With the reading of love letters before a hilarious jury in court was against all his instincts. His chivalry was outraged, his sense of humor was small, and in the course of his career he had lost one or two important cases through an unexpected development of this quality in a jury. The woman had evidently noticed his hesitation, but mistook its cause. "It ain't me, but my darter." The Colonel recovered his politeness. "Oh, I'm relieved, dear madam. I could hardly conceive a man ignorant enough to, throw away such evident good fortune, or base enough to deceive the trustfulness of a woman matured and experienced only in the chivalry of our sex. The woman smiled grimly. Yes, it's my darter, Zaidie Hooker. So you might spare some of them pretty speeches for her, before the jury. The colonel winced slightly before this doubtful prospect, but smiled. Yes, certainly, the jury. But, my dear lady, need we go as far as that? Cannot this affair be settled out of court? Could not this individual be admonished, told that he must give satisfaction, personal satisfaction, for his dastardly conduct to near relative or even valued personal friend? The arrangements, as I say, for that purpose I myself would undertake. He was quite sincere. Indeed, his small black eyes shone with that fire which a pretty woman or affair of honor could alone kindle. The visitor stared vacantly at him and said, slowly, And what good is that going to do us? Compel him to perform his promise, said the colonel, leaning back in his chair. Catch him doing it, said the woman scornfully. No, that ain't what we're after. We must make him pay. Damages. And nothing short of that. The colonel bit his lip. I suppose, he said gloomily, you have documentary evidence, written promises and protestations, love letters, in fact? No, nary a letter. You see, that's just it, and that's where you come in. You've got to convince that jury yourself. You've got nothing to show what it is. Tell the whole story your own way. Lord, to a man like you, that's nothing. Startling as this admission might have been to any other lawyer, Starbottle was absolutely relieved by it. The absence of any mirth-provoking correspondence and the appeal solely to his own powers of persuasion actually struck his fancy. Of course, said the colonel confidently, there is strongly presumptive and corroborative evidence. Perhaps you can give me a brief outline of the affair? Zaidie can do that straight enough, I reckon, said the woman. What I want to know first is, can you take the case? The colonel did not hesitate. His curiosity was piqued. I certainly can. I have no doubt your daughter will put me in possession of sufficient facts and details to constitute what we call a brief. She can be brief enough, or long enough, for the matter of that, said the woman, rising. The colonel accepted this implied witticism with a smile. And when may I have the pleasure of seeing her? He asked, politely. Well, I reckon as soon as I can trot out and call her. She's just outside, meandering in the road. Kind of shy, you know, at first. She walked to the door. The astounded colonel nevertheless gallantly accompanied her as she stepped out into the street and called shrilly, You Zaidie! A young girl here apparently detached herself from a tree and the ostentatious perusal of an old election poster and sauntered down towards the office door. Like her mother, she was plainly dressed. Unlike her, she had a pale, rather refined face, with a demure mouth and downcast eyes. This was all the colonel saw as he bowed profoundly and led the way into his office, for she accepted his salutations without lifting her head. He helped her gallantly to a chair, on which she seated herself sideways somewhat ceremoniously, with her eyes following the point of her parasol as she traced a pattern on the carpet. A second chair offered to the mother. That lady, however, declined. I reckon I'll just leave you and Zaidie together to talk it out, she said, turning to her daughter. She added, Just you tell him all, Zaidie. And before the colonel could rise again, disappeared from the room. In spite of his professional experience, Starbottle was, for a moment, embarrassed. The young girl, however, broke the silence without looking up. Adoniram K. Hotchkiss, she began in a monotonous voice, as if for a recitation addressed to the public, first began to take notice of me a year ago. Arter that, off and on. One moment, interrupted the astounded colonel. Do you mean Hotchkiss, the president of the Ditch Company? He had recognized the name of a prominent citizen, a rigid ascetic, taciturn middle-aged man, a deacon, and more than that, the head of the company he had just defended. It seemed inconceivable. That's him, she continued, with eyes still fixed on the parasol and without changing her monotonous tone. On and off ever since. most of the time at the Free Will Baptist Church at morning service, prayer meetings and such, and a home outside in the road. Is it this gentleman, Mr. Adoniram K. Hotchkiss, who proposed marriage? Stammered the colonel. Yes. The colonel shifted uneasily in his chair. Most extraordinary, for, you see, my dear young lady, this becomes a most delicate affair. That's what Ma said, returned the young woman simply, yet with the faintest smile playing around her demure lips and downcast cheek. I mean, said the colonel with a pained yet courteous smile, that this gentleman is, in fact, one of my clients. That's what Ma said, too. And of course your knowing him will make it all the easier for you, said the young woman. A slight flush crossed the colonel's cheek as he returned quickly and a little stiffly. On the contrary, it may make it impossible for me to act in this matter. The girl lifted her eyes. The colonel held his breath as the long lashes were raised to his level. Even to an ordinary observer, that sudden revelation of her eyes seemed to transform her face with subtle witchery. They were large, brown, and soft, yet filled with an extraordinary penetration and prescience. They were the eyes of an experienced woman of 30 fixed in the face of a child. What else the colonel saw there, heaven only knows. He felt his most inmost secrets plucked from him, his whole soul laid bare. His vanity, belligerency, gallantry, even his medieval chivalry, penetrated and yet illuminated in that single glance. And when the eyelids fell again, he felt that a greater part of himself had been swallowed up in them.